Hey everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Unger. I'm co-founder and partner at Cultique, a cultural insights and strategy consultancy. We help people analyze shifts in culture to help people, brands, and products have more impact in a world of constant change. Today, we'll be talking about a really important topic, mental health, something that's very top of mind for all of us in 2020, given the challenging year it's been. So we're going to talk about the state of Gen Z, or rather Zoomer, mental health, and how young people are driving cultural shifts and how society talks about our feelings. So I have two very knowledgeable people with me to discuss this, and I'm really excited to have a heartfelt and candid convo on a sometimes hard to discuss topic. So my hope is that we'll get real and relatable today. First up, we have Laurel Weir, a client of ours who is on the front lines of researching Zoomers as the Executive Vice President of Strategic Insights and Research across Viacom CBS's Entertainment and Youth Group. So this includes MTV, VH1, Comedy Central, Paramount Network, TV Land, CMT, Pop TV, Logo, and the Smithsonian Channel. So Laurel, just to level the playing field here, this is a really candid convo on mental health. I want to kick it off with a quick emotional check. So how are you feeling today?
Well, hi, Sarah, and hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. How am I feeling today? I guess I would say I'm cautiously optimistic, and it's in my nature to be optimistic always, but I don't like to take anything for granted. So that's why I throw in the cautiously. And with everything we've got going on in the world, that feels right.
I'm here for it. Thanks, Laurel. Our second panelist is Megan Collins, who's an analyst at Cultique and Gen Z expert who worked in tandem with Laurel's team this past summer to do a deep dive into the world of mental health as it relates to Zoomers. So, Megan, same question, spotlight on you. What's your mood?
I am feeling tired. I think a lot of us are tired. 2020 has been a lot to grapple with, but I'm also feeling very inspired, and I'm really excited to be here today. So I'm tired, but inspired and excited to talk more about Zoomers and mental health.
Great. Well, I'm going to draft off their emotions. I'm cautious, optimistic, tired, and inspired, all three. So that sounds good. So, Laurel, can you first set the stage for us on the term Zoomers? It's a term you and your teams have been using, and I'd love to hear why. What is a Zoomer?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great starting point. If you think about it, Zoomer is Gen Z and Boomer, those two words combined. It's very similar to millennials, this sort of shift in terminology. Prior to 2008, millennials were known as Gen Y. And when the Great Recession happened, boomers ended up ascribing the name millennials to Gen Y, and we've sort of used that name ever since. Zoomers is the word being ascribed to Gen Z, really post-COVID, and it's inspired by the digital interaction that we've all been sort of leaning into since we've all been at home in these COVID days. Now, they are digital natives, so it came much more intuitively to this generation to be really led. They think of a digital world as more of as the same as in real life versus other generations. And so, we are taking a Zoomer-led approach here at our brands, at MTV and our portfolio, and journalists and other thought leaders and researchers who cover Gen Z are doing the same. So MTV and our portfolio of brands are really taking cues from Gen Z, including the terminology, and really leaning into using the word Zoomer since they've truly ascribed it to themselves.
Zoomers it is. So Megan, can you talk to me a little bit about why Gen Z is being spotlighted in 2020? Are we all Gen Zers this year? As a millennial, can I say I'm feeling very Gen Z, or is that kind of an overstretch? Keep me honest.
It depends. So what we're seeing is that COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter have really accelerated cultural values, sensibilities, and priorities that are really informed by Gen Z. And so it's really normalizing and forefronting them in culture at large. I foreshadowed all of the tiredness I'm feeling because of all these things that we've been dealing with all year. But for Gen Z, this is pretty normal. They're a generation that has only known a country in decline. If you think about it, they were very young when 9/11 happened. Laurel mentioned the Great Recession. They're dealing with school shootings, partisan divides, and then on top of all that, one of their main issues that we know about climate crisis. So they have been long familiar in the language of activism, trauma, and its corresponding mental health challenges that come along with it. You talk about climate anxiety. And the rest of the world has kind of reoriented in 2020 in response to COVID and the racial justice movement to prioritize the same concerns as Zoomers. Their digitally savvy, their action-oriented approach to expertly navigating challenges is also being up-leveled right now as we're looking at this generation who's kind of taken the millennial slacktivist agenda and really iterated on it, right? They're not just going to talk about it online. They're going to pair what they're doing online with IRL action and make necessary change. And this is all compounded by the fact that due to the pandemic, in-person communication and gathering has been limited. It's risky, it's scary. And so in a way, yes, we are all living like digitally native Gen Zs. We're online all the time. And the online world is really their world. They set the rules, they dictate the standards. And now we're seeing the in real life IRL world head the same way as we look more to Gen Z to inform society and their values.
That makes sense. So now that we've peeled back the onion a little bit on Zoomer and Gen Z, I want to dive into the heart of the mental health convo, which is why everyone tuned in today. So Laurel, talk to me a bit about where mental health sits in the Zoomer priority set. Where does it rank?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have some new research and more to come on that. But, one of the things we're finding in our research is a really interesting flip in Zoomer values. One of the things that we found was that looking at the top 10 things that Zoomers value in 2020, mental health has really surged to the top, moving up to number 3. And conversely, we find that valuing fun, sadly for this very young generation, has dropped to number 7 from number 3. And as we've talked about, the confluence of traumatic events is playing a role in this, but also Zoomers' value system. They are such an empathetic generation that plays a role in their hunger for activism and their participation in activism, which is just so amazing. But also they prioritize education. And I think putting all of these things together, learning about what's going on in the world, learning about how they can try to help themselves is a top priority. And so when you sort of put all together the values of a Zoomer, it makes sense to us that we're seeing this increase of mental health to very high on the list of such a young generation's value rank.
Yeah, it's quite the
And as Laurel mentioned, they are fluent in the language of activism and trauma. They're dealing with this confluence of traumatic events. So what we're seeing is while they understand it and they can name it, they are still, young adults and teenagers. And so while they may be fluent in the language, it's not necessarily translating to coping mechanisms is what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. So does this mean that Zoomers are better at handling their mental health than other generations? If they have the vocabulary, it's clearly a priority. One might intuitively think that would mean that they're prioritizing mental health and in a better spot overall. But based on the fact that we're having this conversation and calling it a crisis, I feel like keep me in the loop here. Elaborate, please.
Yeah, we're finding they're feeling, despite all of this, and they're so aware, but despite that awareness, they're feeling less equipped than other generations, feeling less confident than other generations in managing it. As we've said, they're digital natives, and social media in general can be more mentally taxing. We saw another piece of our research that it was really at a juxtaposition of both the advantages and disadvantages of social media. As you can see in this pie chart here, nearly 50% say social media gives mental health a positive boost, while at the same time, that 53% is saying it has a negative effect. Now, on the positive side, it gives them a way to leverage social change. It gives them connectivity while we're all isolated. It also helps them learn. Talked about education, right? Learn about social issues. Well, on the negative side, they feel very reliant on tech. There's also an overwhelming amount of info, for better or worse, via social media. And there's that, especially as it relates to their age group, that pressure to look a certain way. And it's just quite a double-edged sword.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's important to note is, speaking of double-edged swords, this is a generation largely raised by Gen X, and their Gen X parents are very invested in their emotional well-being, and they really, really want them to be happy. So Gen X, for those of you who don't know, are the latchkey kid generation. Their parents weren't as on top of them. They were, left to roam free as they pleased, and they kind of said to themselves, I'm not going to be that for my kids. So I'm going to make sure that I'm always there. I'm very present. And they're very emotionally invested in their kids, their well-being, and their happiness. But what we're seeing is that this is actually putting a lot of pressure on kids and Gen Z to be really happy. And that's actually contributing to the mental health crisis, because then they do a self-evaluation of, well, I'm not happy. I mean, look around at 2020. And then they kind of say, well, something must be wrong with me because there's no reason I shouldn't be happy. I have everything I need. This is a generation who's very aware of privilege and all of the hardships in the world. So they understand when they don't have to face those. But then also they are facing a lot of mentally taxing things like the racial justice movement, climate change, and then the whole pandemic this year. And that's really disrupted their life and what they're meant to be doing at this life stage. And then social media, as Laurel said, acts similarly to parents in that it's defined by millennials as a highlight reel. But right now we're in a time where, there aren't a whole lot of highlights to be sharing. And we're seeing them push back to this idea of having to be happy all the time. So, for example, one of the most famous Gen Zs, Dixie D'Amelio, has a song that says, sometimes I don't want to be happy. Don't hold it against me. And I think this really captures how Gen Z is embracing a bit more of emotional fluidity. It's okay to not be happy all the time. Sometimes you can be sad. Sometimes you can be angry. And saying that you can share those emotions on social media as well. So as Laurel mentioned, we're seeing it as a double-edged sword. Yes, social media does put pressure on Gen Z to be happier, but it also is moving in a direction as they are taking control of social media and really imbuing social media with their values in embrace of different forms of expression and emotional expression on social media.
That makes a lot of sense. I know when I get and telling me to enjoy something in this moment, I'm like, well, what if I don't feel like enjoying it? What if it's a reprieve? What if it's an escape? So I feel that, and I know in our research we had long looked at whether pressure to be happy has created cycles of depression in the US among all generations. So it makes sense that it's acutely happening.
Yeah, and what we're seeing, you think of Gen Z, they're digitally native, they're all creators. Even if they aren't all quote unquote influencers, they all have followers and they all have online brands and personas. And I think right now, social media is especially tricky because you have this online brand you created, but you might not feel the way that you did last year. So you have to deliver on this brand, especially for top creators on YouTube, for instance, very positive lifestyle content. But if you're not feeling positive and you're not feeling like, investing in your lifestyle right now, you're not going anywhere. It leads to this kind of dichotomy where you're not living up to, again, that self-evaluation of, well, what's wrong with me that I'm not able to do those things? And it's creating more mental health struggles.
So in a world where a range of emotions are acceptable, when you look at how that looks on social media, talk to me a little bit about how that plays out for Zoomers, in regards to not only the aesthetic of your Instagram feed, but also how Zoomers perceive cancel culture.
Yeah. So what we're seeing is that they're flocking to platforms like TikTok that are more catered to their mood than being like Instagram, which is very much a highlight reel. It's where you put your best moments, things that make you happy, pretty pictures. Whereas TikTok is a little bit deeper in that, it creates memes and ways to express different emotions that aren't always great. And this is largely driven by Gen Z and how they're working through experiences and expressing emotions in mimetic formats and even using humor to talk about difficult things. For example, the something traumatic happened to me in my life check is a way for them to share something, but it can also be done in a humorous way, in a relatable way, and it opens up that door for communication. And we're also seeing that when it comes to Gen Z, they are pushing back against cancel culture a little bit. As Laurel mentioned, they're a very empathetic generation. They've grown up, they're literally growing up online. So it's understandable that they're going to make mistakes, right? They innately empathize because they're growing up in front of a crowd, whether that crowd is 1,000,000 people or 100 people in their class, they're growing up in front of a crowd. The mistakes they're making online are able to be screenshotted and shared and live on forever. So even if they're not influencers, they still have this audience of their peers, friends, and classmates via social media. They can relate to the influencer struggle, what it's like to make a misstep, have that taken out of context, and then get all of this backlash for it. And we actually saw some creators like Jenna Marbles quit their platforms over past controversies coming up again. And she was very candid about her emotional struggle of having to continue to revisit these mistakes she had made in the past and feeling like she couldn't move on because they were online, they existed, in perpetuity, and anyone could bring them up at any time.
I still miss Jenna's plant house tours. I'm mourning the loss of those. Okay, we have a live audience question, and I think, Laurel, I'd love for you to take this one. It's specific to how these pressures that we're talking about on Zoomers, how they relate to older generations. So when you say to older generations who use this openness to say these generations are more emotional, or back in my day, depression didn't exist, what do you think of that?
I would say that what we're hearing from Zoomers is, especially as it relates to Gen X, and I think Megan covered some of this, is there's now more of an openness to really embrace the emotional fluidity. And we're finding that parents haven't been very helpful. As it relates to Gen Xers who tend to be the parents, or baby boomers who at times may be grandparents, it does impact sort of their thinking and how they were raised and how certain things were taboo. And so what we're trying to do, especially at our brands, is really bring forward through content. We're doing some new research as it relates to how to inform mental health representation in content, be it, media, television, social media, all of those different places. So we can really help Zoomers with depicting the honest ups and downs, showing what healthy mental health dialogue looks like, building the awareness around it, I think is a key piece too. And giving them links to resources and experts, helping them rediscover fun. We need fun back up on those ranks. So we're really seeing that the older generations can really take a page out of the Zoomer's book and learn from them, as they really need the support, though, from these older generations and those of us in media that sort of have a responsibility to move the conversation forward.
It makes sense. So content can help normalize for all generations these conversations.
Absolutely.
Megan, please jump in.
Yeah, in the work that we did with Laurel's team to inform this media guide, we had the opportunity to speak with mental health experts in a variety of fields. And one of the ones we spoke to was an adolescent psychologist who made this really great point about, comparing Gen Z to an aquarium of fish. And he said, it doesn't matter what happens. If the water is bad, it's not going to be a good environment for the fish. So when you look at older generations who are saying, well, this wasn't a problem in my day, or depression wasn't a thing when I was younger, the water was better. Or if it was not, and what we're seeing now is that Gen Z are dealing with, as we mentioned, all of the things that are happening in 2020, but then also being exposed to these things via social media from a younger age, and being exposed to the problems in the world, and also being armed with the knowledge that it's going to fall on their shoulders to fix it, right? Gen Z is very aware of all of the problems, whether it's in politics, in society, in the climate, and they're also very aware that these are, high stakes problems that are going to fall on their generation to fix, and they've known that for a very long time. So that's a very large weight to carry. They're still very young, and they're still forming their opinions of the world. They're still forming as people, and that's a lot to grapple with. So it's not as simple as to say, oh, this wasn't a thing when I was younger, because the world has changed so much. And that only goes to make Gen Z feel like they're even more misunderstood. We talk a lot, and I talk a lot about life stage versus generation, but Gen Z is really a generation that is dealing with something completely unprecedented, right? So it's harder for their parents to understand exactly what they're going through, because they are literally, speaking a different language online, and they are dealing with a completely different set of circumstances than their parents were.
And I'll add to that. Sorry, Sarah. luckily, right, the normalization of therapy has given Zoomers the language, right, to talk about their feelings and to be able to articulate and understand emotion better than youth and generations past by far. So that is definitely a step in the right direction on this topic.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on how older generations can talk to Zoomers in this regard? Is there a little, humility required to learn from our youngers, perhaps?
Yeah, I think there is a bit of an opportunity to learn from our youngers, and we've talked a bit about how do we normalize failure, right? We've talked a bit about that, and if you're living in 2020, failure does feel pretty normal right now, based on everything that has happened this year. My goodness, and they are definitely an emotion forward generation. And if we can bring forth their conversations in culture, and really try to move away from this ruse of perfection, right? And really wanting that. I think the older generation can really continue to take a page out of their book. I mean, listen, they have grown up in a chaotic world, right? And they've had to adapt at such a young age. And social media has been such a reminder of this confluence of traumatic events that have made these digital natives so aware. So we're really seeing it as, needing the older generation, in particular parents and teachers, to really support them, give them the tools they need, normalize more of these emotions and this potential for failure. But boy, can we learn so much from this generation. It's pretty amazing.
I want to highlight what Laurel said about Gen Z being an emotion forward generation, because that's really the way in. And when you talk about platforms that they love, like TikTok, those platforms really lean into that, right? There's different versions of TikTok. You can go on horror TikTok, dark academia TikTok, and it's really responsive and, like Gen Z, adaptive to how you're feeling and what you want to see. And that's how they're looking, and that's their relationship with content or with social media or technology or even their friends and their environments, right? They're very in touch with their emotions, mood, vibes, aesthetics. These are all things that they are attracted to and kind of the language that they're speaking in. And so they're also a generation that is not looking to change their worldview to fit into the world that currently exists, because they understand that they're going to have to rebuild and remake that. So they really want brands to meet them on their level, right? Start with where they're at rather than trying to bring them into your world. You need to go into their world and speak their language and meet with them on their terms.
Wow. These are both really good points. And honestly, I feel a weight just lifted off knowing that we can talk about things more openly and candidly in regards to normalizing mental health, therapy, all of the things that come with being a human in 2020. In terms of older generations moving in on TikTok, for example, and other platforms where Zoomers are really being more open and honest in regards to mental health. Do Zoomers care that older generations are using them, that these are being used en masse? Does that make the platform or space feel less safe or cool? What do you guys think?
I would say that they're actually introducing TikTok to older generations. One thing that we saw in the beginning of the pandemic was a lot of Zoomers getting their parents on TikTok, right? Mm-hmm. And saying this is something fun for us to do together as a family, or even just incorporating their family into the jokes and memes that they were making on TikTok. And also, TikTok is made up of a bunch of communities. So just because there's like an older contingent, they could completely be missing that on their For You page if they're just, in their little bubble, tracking the Hype House drama or whatever that they're doing. And this also, as I said, is not a generation who is very much, they're not necessarily looking to gatekeep coolness, I would say, the way that millennials are, as long as you're looking to, again, respect what they've created, validate it and adopt it rather than try to change it and make it your own. They're very welcoming and would love to have anybody in, as they're more focused on mindset than anything.
And I would echo that. Our team did some wonderful virtual diaries over the summer. And with them spending so much time at home, so much time with their parents, they're such an inclusive generation. And again, the empathy, the education, all of that together. We saw many of them working on TikTok with their parents. Also an opportunity to just have conversations at home about everything. There's plenty of topics this year as it relates to what's going on in the world, and they've taken advantage of those opportunities to discuss with the older people in their household.
And I think that's why what Laurel and her team taking a Gen Z-led approach is so great, because again, it's not necessarily looking to dictate what they should be doing. They are validating that this is, well thought out. This is in response to what's happening in culture, and this is an authentic portrayal of how your generation is feeling. So we're going to up-level that and validate that and give that a platform rather than trying to make you bend to society as it currently is.
Mm-hmm.
It's well said. And, in this year, who knows what we should be doing? There's no should. Everyone's just figuring it out as we go. So talk about sort of normalizing failure and challenge. I feel like the society has given us the perfect entry point. So I have another audience question, and I'm just going to read it verbatim, and I want you both to weigh in with what comes to mind. Once life gets back to normal in quotes, do you think that social media will take on a more negative viewpoint once it isn't needed to stay connected? Or could this year help make social media a more positive place? That's our audience question.
Laurel, do you want to go first? Or you want me to go first? I'm happy to go first.
Go ahead.
I think that what we're seeing is kind of a reconsideration of social media and social media uses. Gen Z is seeking out positivity. What we saw at the beginning of the TikTok boom is that people were drawn to it because it was a very positive place. The comments were a very positive, interaction. It was looking to be fun. Again, this is not a generation that's looking to gatekeep or bring people down. And so what we're seeing is the platforms respond to this by trying to create more what I call good faith interactions, whether that's on Twitter, limiting who can respond to your content, who can retweet you, or whether that's on TikTok saying like, I don't want this to be on the For You page. That's now an option that you can do. So it's kind of reconsidering who are you putting your content out there for? And there's so much content out there now that if you don't like something, they're more likely to move on than they are to take the time to troll or add hate to that thing, because they're not looking to interact with content that they don't like. They're looking to seek out more of what they like, what is filling their need states and speaking to their emotions in the moment.
Great. And I would add, I think, there's a positivity around it when we go back to normal, air quotes, right? That gives Zoomers the ability to continue to leverage social change on a broad scale, right? And that wider connectivity gives them that voice outside of their own communities, gives them more of a national voice, and activism is so important to them. Social change is they really consider themselves the most socially conscious generation ever. And so they want to walk that talk, and social media gives them an opportunity to do that at a wider scale.
You're right. We've seen the internet become a source of all sorts of new forms of activism, joyful activism, mimetic activism. So I really like that you brought that up. Sort of going back to just examples of this type of normalized mental health discussion and content, I think, I remember seeing it in a lot of celebrity biographies. It seemed like each one was a documentary of mental health, whether you look at Justin Bieber, Taylor Swift's, Miss Americana, Paris Hilton's. Talk to me a little bit about content and how we're seeing it normalized so far, and if you have examples of things that you think are really worth noting should our audience want to tune in and see mental health being discussed in an open and honest way, that would be great.
Yeah, I think this is born of, and again, this is something introduced by millennials, this desire for authenticity, and then taken to the next level by Gen Z. And a lot of the Gen Z celebrities and, public figures are influencers who have a little bit more of a personal relationship with their fans. And you see traditional celebrities like actors and singers adopting this relationship, right? They're getting on Instagram, they're getting on TikTok, they're interacting with their fans one-on-one. And in order to, again, speaking to that you have a brand, but you also are a person, and having that authenticity, we're seeing that they're more open to letting their fans into those spaces that aren't always positive necessarily in the traditional sense of this is a happy moment or this is something to celebrate, but that this is, a difficult moment, or this is something that made me upset, or this is something that I'm working through. Like we saw this with Paris Hilton, Leila Pons, as you mentioned, Justin Bieber, because fans are picking up on these things. They're following them across platforms. They can tell that things are going on deeper, and they want to it comes from a place of empathy and authenticity and wanting to feel connected to their celebrity or the influencer.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
I think from a content standpoint, many shows have been off the air due to COVID, and I think 2021 is going to be a new year, not just in the factual nature of it being a new year, but we've learned so much in 2020, and again with a Zoomer-led approach, authenticity and how we handle mental health and how we handle inclusivity and representation. I think those values are really going to come to the forefront for new content in 21.
I want to talk about something that we did not talk about recently, but we've talked about it last year a lot, and I think it's relevant here based on some of the questions we're getting. Talk about performative vulnerability, Megan. I know we would talk about that often in terms of using mental health as sort of a flex symbol to talk about your journey, and how do we distinguish, what's authentic and what's using mental health for marketing, essentially, in an inauthentic way.
Yeah, so performative vulnerability, again, this is an idea introduced by millennials and then approved upon by Gen Z. You'll see that that's a theme in culture. But it's this idea of influencers having this moment where they understand that people were kind of tiring of the highlight reel and just like, my life is so great all the time. You should be envious of me. You should be jealous of me, especially as the world was starting to become clear that the world was not a great place. And so what you saw is influencers kind of pivot and say, okay, I need to share some of the less highlight reel portions of my life. But it ended up feeling very performative because it's still, a beautiful picture, but then the caption will be, I was really sad when this picture was taken, here's why. Or a video where they're crying, the YouTube apologies. All of this is vulnerability, but it's very performative, right? It's not necessarily in the moment coming from an authentic place. Whereas Gen Z has improved upon this, especially on TikTok, to just share how they're, and again, those memes and those formats that give them the space and open up the conversation to share those moments in a way that feels more authentic and more relatable than an attention-seeking, clickbaity type way that the millennials kind of introduced for Instagram and YouTube.
Mm-hmm. Can you have an authentic mental health conversation in a meme or an emoji? Mental health is such an in-depth and nuanced thing. Is an upside down face enough to encapsulate the depth of our, deep, dark emotions? What do you think, Laurel?
I just think even the presence of that on the smallest scale of not having to feel that you're performing all the time and that you have to act differently on social media, I think that's such a step in the right direction that we can be more authentic, even if it's just simple as a frowning emoji. It's a step in the right direction that I think will just continue to gain traction. And that's a big difference, I think, between Zoomers and millennials as we're seeing that pivot in how they express themselves, and the empathy that leads to the authenticity is really great.
My millennial self feels very relieved at having you say that. The veneer of perfection, the ruse of perfection, as you said, Laurel. I loved that. Great phrase. I'll just throw that back in someone's face when I'm being asked to perform. A few more questions, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. I could talk all day about this just because it's so cathartic. But do you think just the pressure to look a certain way, let's talk about kind of physical form and appearance, is that unique to Zoomers? Or is it more now that our lives are so on display with being public on social media? And this is a question from the audience. The person mentions how, when they think of older generations, they think of people looking physically much more buttoned up. Now during 2020, we're seeing a lot of parents working from home. Their lives are scattered. There's, babies in the background. Talk to me about this. Is this trickling up to other generations too, the physical openness in terms of how we present?
Yeah, I think one thing that we found in the research that we did with Laurel's team that was really interesting is, again, the pressure to look a certain way. That's a life stage thing, right? That's just a natural process of being human. You want to fit in with your peers. You want to be accepted by your peers. And so there's pressure to look a certain way. And you would think that Gen Z embracing fluidity and self-expression, it wouldn't matter what you look like. But what we're actually seeing is that they so much value creativity, free expression, and individuality that there is pressure to convey all of this with your sartorial looks and what you choose to wear. You see this with Gen Z's emphasis on streetwear, which is defined by scarcity because it's about being in the know, right? I knew that the drop was this day. I was able to cop this item. And that's why it's communicating more than just, I have the money to spend on this item. It's also communicating I'm cool enough to understand what is cool, when it's dropping, and I have the resources, the network, whatever it is to get it. And so it's actually more pressure because it's in person and also on social media and then TikTok. And then, you have to resell it on Depop. So you would think that it would be actually less pressure because this generation is empathetic and fluid, but it's actually counterintuitively more.
Wow. It's kind of a vicious cycle of self-expression. Double-edged sword, you've called it before, Laurel.
Yeah, self-expression is so important to them. And we're finding, just hearing it over and over again, they're less likely, if you ask them to describe themselves or who they are, they're less likely to lead with age and gender, like many of the older generations would be. And they're more likely to lead with what they're passionate about and that creativity and that expression.
Yeah. Fun. Number 8 on the ranking, though. That's self-expression isn't necessarily fun, to your earlier data point. Okay, so I think we're just about out of time. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience is very relieved to hear the industry talking about mental health in such a realistic way. Do you have any final thoughts, closing thoughts we didn't get to address before you want to share with us? Has your mood changed at all since we've had this conversation?
My mood is still the same. I would say just, one thing that's interesting about Gen Z is that they've created this whole, in addition to the language they've learned of mental health, they've created a whole language around mental health on social media and the platforms that they're using. You mentioned the upside down emoji. And so just really paying attention to those. And they're going to become part of the way that we communicate, right? Right now it may seem like, oh, that's just a trend or that's just a slang word. But no, it's them pioneering a new form of emotional expression that's a little bit deeper. They created millennials would always say, I remember this meme when I was in high school, there should be a sarcasm font. Gen Z made it. And so looking at these mimetic qualities and the way that they communicate as being the future and not just, a trend or something that the youth are doing that is going to pass.
Yeah, and it makes me think of just, when we think of Zoomers, we also think of resilience and everything they've been through since birth. Resilience has been a staple for Zoomers. And I think, recalibrating the cultural point of view as it relates to failure, as it relates to emotion, can just be so beneficial to mental health. And, I'm really excited about this generation. I feel like I've learned so much about Zoomers and, as we see this generation become, sort of in the driver's seat of adulthood and the future, and they will bring us forward. I think it's a really exciting generation to do that.
Yeah, and I'm, as a consumer, excited to see the content that comes out of this period, as you mentioned, with heightened mental awareness on MTV and the other brands that you inform, Laurel. So we have that to look forward to.
Yes.
Thank you to everyone for joining us today. So please be sure to keep the conversation going in the official VidCon Discord server, and make sure to check out the agenda to get registered for some more VidCon Now sessions. And also, you can follow cultique.co on Instagram to hear more of our ongoing thoughts regarding mental health, what's shifting, terms to watch, and how we can talk about feelings. So thanks again, and have a good day.